Alright, so I've been following a bunch of these, what do you call, memes on Facebook, a lot of articles around there. You know, it's kind of schizophrenic when I hear, what was it, that Judge Janine, really throwing a bunch of hate and blame toward Barack Obama for so-called creating ISIS in the wake of the Syrian civil war and support against the Assad regime. Well, first of all, we need to look at why the United States would have had policies against the Assad regime. In the Middle East, early in the 2000s, early 2000s, late 90s, one of the American allies over there was the Kurdish freedom movement. Now, the Kurds have been divided up into a few different factions, some of which were fighting Saddam Hussein in Iraq, others were fighting against the Iranians, although not all that hard. They were kind of like, had kind of reached a point of truce with the Iranians. And then there was some bitter stuff between them and the Turks, which went on for a long time. A lot of back and forth stuff. The Turks were engaged in oppression and genocide. The Kurds were engaged in terrorism and crime. And then there was a situation in Syria, some other issues going on with that. And mainly it had to do with the fact that between the Ottoman Turks and the British beating the Turks, somebody wanted to change the maps to recognize Kurdistan, which was definitely an ethnic, and I mean, the Kurdish people are a nation. But when they became conveniently allied with the United States, there was a series of incidents in the late 90s where basically they got fucked over in a way that the Cuban freedom fighters got fucked over at the Bay of Pigs. And they were going to rise up, they're going to overthrow Saddam Hussein, or at least create a sovereign territory that would have served a lot of different purposes in the Middle East. And then when the air support was called in, they didn't get it. And it had been promised, there were a lot of CIA people on the ground who were helping them, who had been promised air support. My understanding is several of them quit the service in protest and had made their own books and videos and stories about how the Kurds were sold out. In the eve of the invasion of Iraq, a lot of these people reconnected with the Kurds, said, we're really going to support you this time. Blackwater connected with them. A lot of the contractor companies that had to hire so-called local Iraqis were actually hiring Kurds to work in the rest of Iraq. So America's relationship with them had solidified over the years. However, prior to that, they had their own independent movement, and they were in conflict with Iran back when Iran was an ally, and they were in conflict with Turkey when Turkey was an ally, and they were in conflict to some degree with the Syrian government. There was a political party that was active in those areas called the Ba'athist Party, and there was also another party which was kind of a social movement of sorts that was related to the Muslim Brotherhood that was also active in those areas. Now, everybody knew that these different groups and different factions would step into the power vacuum as soon as there was a cohesive movement to overthrow Assad, and nobody wanted to be on a losing side of that because all those people in that part of the world tend to get pretty brutal when they win. So what happened is the U.S. Realized how shifting alliances work over there. There were concerns about whether or not American troops would be over there. And people really thought it was going to be mano-a-mano fighting. Yeah, there's some brutality, but they kind of had this little sense of honor among each other about how they play. What's happened is, obviously, what's happened in the news and what people have realized is those people have gone straight up medieval. Now, have we seen this in recent history? Yes, we did. We saw this in the Balkans conflict in the 1990s. And in the Balkans conflict, the designated bad guys were the Serbs. But we have to also realize that Milosevic went to his grave screaming that he was the first guy to be fighting Al-Qaeda, that he was fighting against the Muslim extremists who were really going to do a lot of bad stuff and were looking for a foothold in Europe. And the first people for them to fight would be the Serbs because of the geographical issues with that. And there was a lot of cross allegations and accusations over who was doing what human rights abuses where and who was supporting them. As we know, there were allegations at that point that the United States was on the wrong side of the fence when it came into the Christians versus Muslims conflict. The other people would argue that the Serbs were a bit less than Christian in a lot of their beliefs and behavior, and that the Muslims of that part of the world were a bit less than Muslim in their attitudes and behavior. For example, they supported themselves through banking and drug dealing, largely out of Switzerland at that time. And there was talk of a organization, a transnational Islamic organization that controlled the poppy fields in Afghanistan and was working with that. Now, where you would place responsibility for all of these things is not the same as saying that certain events and certain policy decisions in the United States were contributing factors. You know, a lot of people are responsible for a lot of things, but being responsible and in control, when those things don't match up with each other, they're both diminished. The United States is not fully in control of that situation, obviously. Neither is the United States fully responsible for them. I think most of those people at this stage would tell you the U.S. doesn't give them orders. They don't like the United States. You know, the United States is not in control of them. Therefore, the United States is not responsible for their behavior. The United States government is responsible for setting certain policies and actions of those who are under the command of the U.S. government, such as our military. So when Judge Janine wants to have it both ways and blame one administration for the actions of what's happening over there, and then say, well, Barack Obama's breaking a promise by sending troops, well, what was he supposed to send? Okay, what is anybody supposed to send? How about just allowing the real solution to this situation, which would be sovereign nightly orders? This was addressed in the multinational, multi-language part of Europe when Europe in the Middle Ages was a microcosm of what the world is now. Different languages, different cultures, all within relatively close proximity of each other. There was a rise during the Middle Age of sovereign nightly orders of volunteers who chose to go and fight the Crusades separately from their own governments, because the governments were not always supportive of these things. The government of England almost never supported a crusade officially, but they would unofficially through either various nightly orders or the church. That was one of the reasons why professional soldiers could join one of the nightly orders without necessarily violating their national pride or their nationalism. And it was in that sense that we would talk about the Templars or the precursors to the Masons, but those were only some of the nightly orders. There were several nightly orders, some of which actually still retain charters which are recognized diplomatically as the equivalent to sovereign nations, because they were sovereign military orders. And perhaps somebody should just be allowing and funding those types of organizations. But the question of armed NGOs is something that the UN balks at. The fact is, they aren't coming up with any better solutions to the horrible human rights violations that are happening over there. So if Barack Obama is finally relenting to people who says, hey, send some volunteers over to handle this, that's what's happening. I don't see how Judge Janine can have it both ways, of hating Obama and then Obama saying, listen, yeah, okay, we'll go along with this. You can't have it both ways. If you've got a problem with these things, sure, we'll go look at another part of the internet. We'll change a channel on the TV. But if there are people who want to go over and make a difference, allow them to. And the fact is, the United States has money, collects taxes. You know, maybe we should tax some of the other nations in the Middle East or make them donate toward that. I don't know. But the fact is, as a person with Judeo-Christian beliefs and affinity, I don't like seeing these kids slaughtered. I don't like seeing any of that. I'd like to, you know, if I were still in the military, I would not unvolunteer myself to go on that deployment. And we do have an all-volunteer military. I would probably go now. I've actually worked with some volunteer organizations. I don't hate Muslims. a lot of the victims of these things, a lot of those refugees are refugees for very real reasons. It's because they're from some different Islamic sect which is being attacked and massacred and messed with by the jihadis. And that's the reality. And that's the other problem I'm seeing with a lot of these memes on Facebook. A lot of people think, well, they're all Muslims. Well, they're different factions, okay? And some of the factions don't engage in that kind of shit. And we have to respect the fact that they don't engage in that kind of shit. And if somebody wants to volunteer to go fight that stuff, you probably should let them. You probably shouldn't be handing them a bunch of crap about no-fly lists or what they can't carry on the airplane with them when it's pretty obvious that they're going to go with one of the NGO volunteer organizations to do the fighting, unlike some of the ones where they just end up, maybe they want to go help refugees and they end up as hostages. It's ridiculous. But part of the problem is the people who simply want to blame everything on Obama and not come up with workable solutions.